Tim with Life Center Ministries. Today we're going to be breaking down Romans chapter 10. I apologize for the gap between videos. A lot of people were reaching out looking for Romans 10 that follow along. I appreciate it. I've been really sick for the last 10 or 12 days trying to get past this. So I will post a QR code briefly. We'll take you to our website if you would like to know more about Life Center Ministries, where we are, what we do, etc. And we're going to get into Romans 10 from the New Living Translation. So in chapter 9, Paul talked about the sovereignty of God regarding election. In chapter 10, Paul shifts to the human responsibility regarding salvation. In this chapter, Paul argues that Israel's failure to accept the Messiah is not due to lack of opportunity or lack of zeal, but rather a refusal to submit to God's method of salvation, which is right standing by faith. Picking up in Romans 1. Dear brothers and sisters, the longing of my heart and my prayer to God is for the people of Israel to be saved. I know what enthusiasm they have for God, but it is misdirected zeal, for they don't understand God's way of making people right with himself. Refusing to accept God's way, they cling to their own way of getting right with God by trying to keep the law. For Christ has already accomplished the purpose for which the law was given. As a result, all who believe in him are made right with God. So Paul begins this section with a sympathetic tone, much like Romans chapter 9. He feels compelled to relate his heart regarding his fellow Jews. He does not accuse the Jews of apathy. He credits them with zeal, but he says it's been misdirected. It's been misdirected zeal. They have zeal, but it's aimed in the wrong place. And the core error of the Jews is that they were attempting to achieve the status of right standing or righteousness with God based on how well they kept the law. They were clinging to their own moral performance rather than clinging to the grace of God. And verse 3 says that they refused to accept. Many versions here say submit rather than accept. They refused to submit to God's way. Right standing with God requires submission. The issue is not lack of effort here, it is a refusal to submit. And in verse 4, I have a cross reference here. Let's go to Galatians. Let's go to Galatians 3:19. Galatians 3:19, Paul says, "Why then was the law given? It was given alongside the promise to show people their sins. But the law was designed to last only until the coming of the child who was promised. God gave his law through angels to Moses, who is the mediator between God and the people." Skipping down to verse 23, "Before the way of faith in Christ was available to us, we were placed under guard by the law. We were kept in protective custody, so to speak, until the way of faith was revealed." Let me put it another way. The law was our guardian until Christ came. It protected us until we could be made right with God through faith. And now that the way of faith has come, we no longer need the law as our guardian. So what Paul is saying here is that the law was never meant to produce righteousness. It was meant to lead us to Christ. Paul is saying that sincerity does not equate to truth. And he's saying that passion does not guarantee righteousness. Back to Romans 10:5. For Moses writes that the law's way of making a person right with God requires obedience to all of its commands. But faith's way of getting right with God says, don't say in your heart who will go up to heaven to bring Christ down to earth, and don't say who will go down to the place of the dead to bring Christ back to life again. In fact, it says the message is very close at hand. It is on your lips and it is on your heart. And that is the very message about faith that we preach. So Paul starts here in verse 5 by referencing Leviticus 18:5. The logic of the law is performance. If you want life through the law, you must execute it perfectly. Partial obedience is insufficient regarding the law. One failure condemns the whole system. And then Paul personifies here righteousness by faith as a speaker. He brilliantly reinterprets here Deuteronomy 30:11 through 14 to make his point about accessibility. He says we don't need to ascend to heaven, so we don't need a heroic spiritual journey to bring Christ down. He has already come. And then he says we don't need to descend into the abyss. We don't need to dive into the depths to bring Christ up. He has already been raised. So the point Paul is making is that salvation is not some distant prize for the spiritual elite to go fetch. It's here, accessible to all right now. You do not need to achieve or retrieve Christ. Faith is not a heroic effort, it is humble reception. Verse 9. If you openly declare that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is by believing in your heart that you are made right with God, and it is by openly declaring your faith that you are saved. So, this is one of the most famous salvation formulas in the New Testament. And Paul says to openly declare, and this is often translated as confess with your mouth. This is not some magic incantation. Now, in the first century, the Lord, the Greek word is kurios, was a title claimed by Caesar. So to say that Jesus is Lord, this was a radical claim. This was a disruptive political and spiritual allegiance that could cost you your life in the first century. It means accepting absolute authority and believing in your heart. This verbal affirmation is not enough. There must be a genuine belief and trust in the historical reality that Jesus Christ died as an atonement for our sins and that he was raised from the dead. In verse 10, Paul breaks it down even more. Belief in your heart is equal to right standing with God, and by openly declaring, which implies being unashamed and willing to openly declare this, that you are saved. The word saved here is the Greek word soteria, and it's a complex word that means a few things. It means salvation, it means deliverance, it means preservation, it means to be restored to health, it means to be kept safe, to rescue, etc., even to be healed. Verse 11. As the scriptures tell us, anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. Jew and Gentile are the same in this respect. They have the same Lord who gives generously to all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So Paul here destroys the imaginary wall between the Jew and the Gentile. He applies the title Lord to Jesus here in a way that equates him with Yahweh. In verse 13, Paul quotes Joel 2:32, and he says, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So in Joel, Lord is Yahweh, YHWH, and he applies this term directly to Jesus. He is saying that Jesus is the Yahweh of the Old Testament acting to save. Verse 14. How can they call on him to save them unless they believe in him? And how can they believe in him if they've never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them? And how will anyone go and tell them without being sent? That is why the scriptures say, how beautiful are the feet of the messengers who bring the good news. But not everyone welcomes the good news. For Isaiah the prophet said, Lord, who has believed our message? So faith comes from hearing, that is, hearing the good news about Christ. So this is the chain here of evangelism, or sometimes called the golden chain of missions. Number one, it's sending; two, preaching; number three, hearing; four, believing; and five, calling. In verse 15, Paul quotes Isaiah 52:7. How beautiful are the feet of the messengers who bring the good news. And the beauty here is not in the messenger's skill level. It's not in how talented they are. It's in the message that's being delivered. Faithfully proclaiming the message, not eloquence, is what God honors. In verse 16, Paul quotes Isaiah 53:1. He hits the brakes here. The reality is that many will not complete this sequence. Many will hear and not believe. Some will believe and not call on him, etc. And then in verse 17, Paul is saying that faith is not a leap in the dark. It comes as a response to a message many times, the message of the gospel or the good news. Hearing here is a reflection as well of first century life. And while there were people in the first century that could read, the ordinary citizen of the first century depended on hearing something. Scholars estimate that roughly 10 to 15% of the population in the first century could actually read and write at this time. So it was a very small people group that could actually read and write. And of those, they were usually Romans, they were higher class individuals that probably weren't hearing this gospel in many cases anyway. Picking up in verse 18. But I ask, have the people of Israel actually heard the message? Yes, they have. The message has gone throughout the earth and the words to all the world. But I ask, did the people of Israel really understand? Yes, they did. For even in the time of Moses, God said, I will rouse your jealousy through people who are not even a nation. I will provoke your anger through the foolish Gentiles. And later, Isaiah spoke boldly for God, saying, I was found by people who were not looking for me. I showed myself to those who were not asking for me. But regarding Israel, God said, all day long I opened my arms to them, but they were disobedient and rebellious. So in verse 18, Paul anticipates this question. Have the people of Israel actually heard the message? He answers with a resounding yes. And then Paul quotes Psalm 19:4. His message is the gospel has been spread widely enough at this point that Israel has no excuse for ignorance. So the problem is not lack of exposure here. The problem is rejection. In verse 19, he asked the second question. Did the people really understand what they heard? So Paul responds by quoting Deuteronomy 32:21 and Isaiah 65:1, explaining how God told Israel many, many years ago that he would bring others close to him. Israel ignored this also, making them even more accountable. Gentile inclusion was always part of God's plan. And then in verse 21, Paul concludes this section with an image of God as portrayed by Isaiah in Isaiah 65:2. God is portrayed here not as a distant judge, but as a rejected lover, standing with outstretched hands to a stubborn people who kept walking away. So God is not distant. God is not indifferent. God is pleading. Judgment comes only after mercy is repeatedly refused. Some key takeaways before we wrap this up. Number one, religious sincerity can still miss Christ. We've seen that over the last few chapters. Number two, gospel clarity matters more than religious activity. Number three, evangelism is not optional, it's necessary. Number four, faith must move from admiration to submission. Number five, you do not need to be a mystic or a scholar to find God. You only need to confess and believe. And that's all we have for Romans 10. If you would join us next time for Romans 11, post that over here, a subscribe button over here. I'll post our QR code for the website if you want to scan that. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless.